Earlier this week with the Bible study group, we had quite an interesting conversation about what does this parable really mean? How many of you think you understand it? So the closest thing that came to mind to me, thinking about this story, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Heist. How about The Shawshank Redemption? Remember that Tim Robbins plays Andy Dufresne, who's a banker, very capable banker who's falsely accused of murdering his wife and her lover because he has motive. And he's in prison, and he breaks the law to launder money because the warden wants him to do it. But somehow his criminality is used for the betterment of the prisoners and everyone's freedom. Kind of think of that parable, that movie as this parable in a nutshell. It's so slippery. It's such an interesting character. The shrewd person. So as the story Luke presents, there's a manager. He's got his hand in the cookie jar maybe taking a little too much off the top. We're living in a very stratified society economically, where the distant landlord makes so much money, the managers make some, and the people who are impoverished working in the fields hardly make any. And he's caught and held to account. What are you doing with my debts? And so he calls up everybody owing his boss money, and he basically is throwing a debt forgiveness party. Oil bill too high? Let's cut that in half. Wheat payments get you down? How about 20 bushels off? And then the part that's really confusing, that's really wild, is his boss congratulates him for it, commends him for it. What do we make of this? Who's he working for? And who is God in this story? So we have to understand the context to understand what Luke is saying in his story. The context around 80 AD when he was writing, the Roman Empire was the context. And these followers are scattered across the empire, and they're reeling from Jerusalem's destruction, because remember, this was a Jewish rabbi. The temple lies in rubble. Old authorities have fled or sold out to Rome. These people knew desperate shrewdness and creativity. They're trying to follow, picture it, a Jewish Messiah. While the Emperor Caesar's eagle, the dark shadow of the eagle, is cast across the empire, they're trying to follow in the ways of a crucified Messiah executed by the empire without getting crucified. Seems pretty absurd, doesn't it? And so when they hear about a manager, the story about a manager facing unemployment without a safety net, they don't think it's a moral failure. They think, another day in the empire, right? It's violent. The manager's world in this story is their world, where the rules are rigged, where playing by the book meant watching neighbors starve, where survival required wisdom, walking the razor's edge between faithfulness and foolishness. And here's what I think Luke's audience would be able to catch that so often evades us. When Jesus says the master commended the shrewd manager, he's using Roman Empire propaganda language. The same word emperors used praising loyal servants. Imagine the in-breath. Imagine the gasps within those little house churches where these followers of Jesus, of this way, of an empire, a realm other than Caesar's, felt about this. Jesus is taking imperial language of the empire and flipping it inside out, suggesting that real loyalty isn't to this distant landlord, but to the network of relationships that keep everyone fed. This manager wasn't just creative, he was subversive, he was shrewd. He transformed a wealth extraction economy into one of mutual aid. He turned debt into a gift, transaction into relationship. And Luke's audience, they'd watch the temple establishment grow increasingly cozy with the Roman Empire, because you kind of had to, forgetting what the temple's purpose was for. They'd seen religious leaders prioritize access over justice. Sound familiar? I think of all the federal workers who've been laid off this past year. Yeah, I see some eyes rolling. Massive cuts in the government, health, human services, education, public media, the environment, DEI programs. And the official line? Efficiency. Yeah, and maybe AI will help with some efficiency, but what about the people? And what about the purpose? What about the purpose of these institutions? And there are so many unsung heroes within the parable that we're living in today. I think of EPA scientists who, before they were laid off, quietly uploaded decades of climate research to university centers. I think of Veterans Administration caseworkers who spent their final days creating detailed records to hand off to the people who were going to be left working with twice as much work to do and half the staff. I think about Forest Service rangers who use their own personal cell phones to coordinate with volunteer groups, ensuring fire prevention programs would continue without funding. Against policy? Probably. But like the shrewd manager, these unsung heroes, and there's so many of them, understood that serving the system's true purpose, their ideals, protecting the environment, caring for veterans, to prevent wildfires from their destruction of people's lives, sometimes means finding creative ways around current constraints. I think about stories here in Oakland, the nurse at Highland who keeps extra blankets in her car for homeless patients before they're discharged. The teacher in West Oakland who partners with local businesses to fund supplies that the district can't. The church that lists a sanctuary as a community meeting space to shelter immigrants without triggering ICE raids. The congregation that calls its food distribution center a potluck ministry to avoid city permitting requirements that would shut it down. This kind of radical faithfulness is alive within 2025, within this country, where increasingly we're told to follow proper channels, respect authority, and trust that the systems work. We live in a culture that increasingly through fear, through violence, worships compliance, where following the rules has become more sacred than serving human dignity. But here's the challenge in this story. It's about shrewdness, the nature of shrewdness and what it's used for, because our systems are shrewd as well. The political and economic machinery around us has mastered its own kind of shrewdness. It knows exactly how to work within legal frameworks while serving extraction over liberation. It's learned to use campaign finance laws, tax codes, regulatory capture to concentrate wealth and power while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. Senator John Ossoff put it perfectly. Yes, the system is rigged, but our current president is not unrigging it. He's re-rigging it for himself. And so there's two different kinds of shrewdness, or purposes for the shrewdness we're seeing. In this parable, the shrewd manager uses his skills to reduce burdens and build community and create a more level playing field, rather than increase burdens and concentrate power. And so the question becomes, why this parable? Who is this shrewd manager working for? And who is the distant landlord? Traditionally, we see the distant landlord, the distant master, as God, the authority figure demanding loyalty. But what if we've got it backwards? Luke's audience would have recognized this absentee landlord immediately. The kind of wealthy elite who lived in luxury while extracting profits from communities they never visited, who cared more about balance sheets and net income than the people whose labor created their wealth. Sound familiar? Sound uncomfortable? Anybody angry? I think about boards of directors of major corporations who never set foot in the factories that generate their dividends, or government officials who make policies far removed from the communities that they're serving. What if, then and now, God isn't the absent, distant landlord? But the creative spirit, moving through the manager's clever, strategic, shrewd, risky wisdom. What if the divine shows up not in distant institutional power, but in every act of choosing relationship and belonging and inclusivity over transaction? This reading, I'm convinced, would have electrified Luke's audience, because they'd watched the temple, God's house, become a collaborator with the empire. Sound familiar? They watched the possibility, they heard and experienced the possibility that the holy was not found necessarily in institutions, but out in the streets, not in sanctuaries. And that, to them, was revolutionary, found in a movement of liberation. So Jesus calls this manager, or Luke uses Greek to call, Jesus describes this manager in the Greek as phronimos, which means shrewd, street smart, wise when the chips are down. It's the same concept as Jesus describing be as wise as serpents, but as innocent as doves. This isn't so much seminary wisdom, it's more like how impoverished mothers stretch every dollar until it can't stretch anymore. Communities turning food pantries into fellowship potluck halls. It's the wisdom to be able to discern between words and actions, between institutional loyalty and authentic faithfulness. So I think this manager's loyalty, this whole story is kind of ambiguous. It doesn't give us easy answers, much like our own world. We're living in this world and we're called to be but not of it, as Teilhard de Chardin put it. Faithfulness doesn't always give us easy answers. We live in this tension of order and justice, playing it safe, and playing for keeps. But maybe that's where we're supposed to be. Maybe this story is about spiritual maturity within ourselves, our own discernment. It's not about having all the right answers, but having the right questions, the courage to ask them. Questions like, what would love do in this situation? How can we make this broken system serve life instead of death? Where is the holy hiding in this unholy mess? I think the manager shows us that sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is to find creative ways to make grace go viral when the rule books say we can't. One person's shrewdness can redeem a system, not just in the movies, not just Andy Dufresne and The Shawshank Redemption. One person's shrewdness can change everything. And movements can change so much more. I think the story is about how God's realm is bigger than our institutions, is bigger than us, is wilder sometimes than our rules. And sometimes redemption comes not by playing by the rules, but by breaking them in the service of something greater. I think this is the invitation of this impossible parable, this wonderfully impossible parable, to be shrewd enough in our love to find ways of serving life in this unholy mess of things, and the courage to take the risk of paying the cost. Because that's what love does. It gets creative. Amen. Okay, let's join in our sermon response, or listen to the music.